a pioneer, as we all know, is a pioneer in innovative mobility strategies. She was among the very first actually, to research and write about the changing dynamics in shared mobility and likely scenarios through which automated vehicle might gain prominence, and is actively working on advanced air mobility and urban air mobility. So she is a professor in civil and environmental engineering department at the University of California at Berkeley. So she is also a co-director of the Transportation Sustainability Research Center of the ITS Berkeley, and also director of UC ITS Resilient and Innovative Mobility Initiative. So she got a PhD from UC Davis and a master from University of Rochester. She authored a lot of journal papers, 85, and the number is still, going up, and edited a lot of books, and also chapters, co-edited 3 books. She served as a chair of the Transportation Research Board Executive Committee. As we all know, this is extremely prestigious, from 21 to 22, and the vice chair from 2020 to 21. In January 2022, she became the chair of the subcommittee for planning and policy review for the TRB Executive Committee. So she received the 2017 Roy W. Crum Award from TRB for her distinguished achievement in transportation research. So in May 2016, she was named as one of the top 10 academic thought leaders in transportation by the Transportation Foundation. So with that, please join me welcoming Dr. Susan Shaheen. And Dr. Shaheen, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the kind invitation. I am delighted to join you today, and love to present to fellow university transportation centers. And I know that this is your gathering celebrating the work that CAMMSE is doing. So I'm going to just take a moment to share my screen. Right, and hopefully you can see that.
Yeah, we can see that.
Excellent. Okay, so this is work that I completed with a team of researchers. I'll be talking about that in a moment, for the University Transportation Center called NICER, and that's the National Institute for Congestion Reduction. And the title of my talk today is Going My Way. What role do the built environment and incentives play in supporting pooling with shared mobility? And this is based on the Photovoice methodology and a study that we employed in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'll start with a brief introduction to our center that led this work as part of NICER and our study team. I'll go over the project background and our study questions, focus a bit on the methodology because some of you may not be familiar with Photovoice. I wasn't before we started this work, and talk about some of our key findings and research areas and overall key takeaways. So as noted in the introduction, I co-direct the Transportation Sustainability Research Center, which is part of the Institute of Transportation Studies at Berkeley. TSRC is about 15 years old, and we focus on researching innovative and applied strategies that incorporate everything from transportation technology to infrastructure and human behavior. And we spend a lot of time developing new data sets, methods, and decision support tools that are very focused on helping people in the real world, planners and policymakers, make decisions about sustainable technologies. And that can include anything from fuels to intelligent transportation systems, to new form factors like devices and the like. So this particular study was led by myself as the principal investigator, and our doctoral student on this study is Wesley Darling. He is now a Ph.D. student in civil and environmental engineering at UC Berkeley. And we were joined by 2 members of the TSRC team, Adam Cohen, and Jacqueline Broader. So what I want to do is start with some definitions, because you'll note that as I walk through this study, I'm going to be referring to a number of these things. So transportation network companies is essentially the policy definition of these ride-hail type services, which include companies like Lyft and Uber. And essentially what they allow is this on-demand ride service, similar to a taxi, fully enabled with online enabled applications and with gig drivers who are typically responsible for the fleet itself. So their personal vehicles or leased vehicles, in contrast to a more dedicated fleet that you might see in a taxi industry, or you might see, for example, in car sharing, something like a Zipcar, where it's a dedicated fleet. It's not owned specifically by individuals. Pooling is a term that can be used to discuss multiple individuals sharing origins and destinations along a common route. And this can include everything from a paid service like a TNC or what we call ride hailing as well, to true ride sharing, where people are already going along that route and they are not making a commercial transaction, but giving somebody else a ride. So pooling is a broader term. And then finally, the term of ride hailing, which is essentially the act of hiring a personal driver to take a passenger to their destination. Ride hailing and TNCs in this study are basically synonymous. I introduced the term ride hailing because that has been more popular in the press, but TNCs is actually the official terminology in the United States when it comes to public policy. So more terms that are really important for you to know because how they inform this study. So this nomenclature actually comes from a prior study that I did with Jessica Lazarus, looking at TNCs and frequency of travel. And so in earlier work that I've done in shared mobility, things like car sharing and bike sharing, what we've seen is that there are actually really distinct differences between frequent users and periodic users. So somebody who uses a TNC 3 times or less per week, and then frequent users, people who use it more times per week. And so we often apply this lens to our work in shared mobility to understand differences that we may see in travel behavior. And what Jessica and I found was indeed there were statistically significant differences between these two groups of users. Next, I want to talk about a distinction in pooling that Jessica and I also looked at in this study. Direct pooling is when users are going from different origins and destinations along that same route, and they're picked up along the way. And so that's typically how you would take a TNC today, is someone would come to where you're located. And in a pooled environment, same thing. Indirect pooling is effectively when the TNC companies or a city, for example, might require that people walk a short distance to a common origin and destination place. And so that is intended to optimize the route, reduce the vehicle miles traveled, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and depending on time of day, potentially address congestion, which is the theme of our center. So I'll be introducing and talking about these different applications a bit in this particular talk. So our study investigates the role of curb management. So we're really focused in this particular study at the curb in the built environment, how people perceive that when they're potentially in the act of taking a pooled ride or a single TNC ride, or if they're linking to public transit. So all of these linkages relate to the curb itself in the built environment. We also wanted to look at targeted incentives, how they might play out in terms of encouraging both pooling and those connections to public transit in order to reduce the vehicle miles traveled, the greenhouse gas emissions, and potentially the congestion. And so what we really wanted to do is take this opportunity to see how much this could come to play if we were to apply more strategies along the lines of policies, potentially subsidies, but also planning tools. How could we actually create more of a taxi stand experience at public transit stations, but also along the curb for these indirect pooling benefits? So these are our 4 research questions. Why are more people not taking pooled ride-hailing trips? So we know from other research that we've done at TSRC on ride-hailing, we've been studying it since the very beginning, about 10 years ago, that not as many of these trips are pooled. Less than 30% were pooled prior to the pandemic, and the pandemic also had a notable impact on ride-hailing. As you might know, many of the services stopped pooling, and now they're getting started, not universally, but across select cities by both Lyft and Uber. How do different factors of the pooled ride-hailing experience impact a ride-hailing user's decision to pool? And so in this particular study, we're really motivated to look at that built environment and how that might play out in terms of feelings of safety and security. Third, what differences exist between frequent and periodic ride-hailing users when we look at some of these questions? And as I noted earlier, we've seen statistically significant differences between people who take ride-hailing services more frequently and in some cases just more periodically. And then finally, how can ride-hailing users be encouraged to share rides and or connect those rides to public transit? So essentially, getting them out of that single occupant TNC or connecting a single occupant TNC to public transit. So overall, this depicts our methodology. So we started with pretty robust literature, and that included everything from shared mobility more broadly to pooling preferences to safety related issues, to looking at curb management and the built environment overall, looking at the role of pricing discounts and incentives, doing a deep dive on the Photovoice methodology that, to our understanding, this may have been the very first application of that in transportation. And then also doing expert interviews to fill gaps. And that was really helpful to us in this study. We did these to explore opportunities and challenges, to help us with the Photovoice method, how it might be modified, particularly as we were in the pandemic at that time. So we weren't able to interface with users in a traditional Photovoice sense, where we would be on the street with them while they were walking and taking photographs, but we had to send them out. And strategies for improving our approach and lessons learned with respect to pooling and TNCs, but also with Photovoice. And then we moved into the Photovoice application with our users. And what we did is we prompted them to take photographs, which you'll be seeing, in terms of their attitudes towards pooling, their safety perceptions, their attitudes towards the built environment, and this indirect and direct option of pickup, along with pooling. And then finally, looking at potential impacts of discounts and incentives in terms of altering their behavior. After we pulled all of this understanding together, we then had a workshop with users who participated in the Photovoice, but also pooling stakeholders. So individuals in the city who control those rights of way and that built environment, and community-based organizations, and others that have a stake in the game, including the companies themselves. And there we explored safety concerns that arose from the TNC Photovoice work. We looked at designated pickup and drop-off areas. And then we also had uncovered during the Photovoice gender-based differences, which we pulled into that workshop. So the methodology itself starts with a lit review. And some of the key findings that we have from this include that time, safety, and access are barriers to widespread pooling behavior. That's probably not surprising to many of you, and it wasn't to us, but we documented that through research. Improvements to curb management strategies in the built environment are very important and could be helpful in addressing pooling barriers alongside incentives. Only a few prior studies to our knowledge at the time of this work have actually engaged ride-hailing users in a more of a qualitative manner. And so we found that actually quite interesting. A lot of the studies tend to focus on activity data and surveys, and less are focused on really engaging the users through focus group discussions. And no prior studies to our knowledge had explored safety of waiting for ride-hailing or safety at those pickup and drop-off locations and those perceptions associated with it. In terms of our expert interviews, there's a number of things I'd like to share. We conducted 4 Photovoice interviews to really get a sense of how people who use this method would advise us to adapt it for bringing it into a pandemic environment where we couldn't interface with our users, but also how to modify it for transportation. It's often used in public health. And we talked to 10 pooling experts, including individuals from the city of Oakland, from Lyft, for example. And all of this happened between October of 2020 and January 2021. Experts shared their best practices on Photovoice methodologies and suggestions, as I noted, for altering into a Zoom environment, which overall I think worked quite well in light of those restrictions. And what we found was that these experts were really able to bring us up to speed in terms of their thoughts and interest in learning more about incentives to increase public transit connections and to create more desirable waiting infrastructure at the curb. So Photovoice, let's dig into this a little bit. So with our method here, what we did is we recruited on Craigslist. The study is indeed focused on the Bay Area. We inquired if they had used private and or pooled TNCs before. We needed to know if they were able to take and upload photos and were able to interface with us on Zoom. So that's kind of how our recruitment began. Then we moved into the photography component of it. So we developed an extensive protocol to help instruct users on how to do this, including a little video. And we asked them to visit 3 TNC pickup locations that they might use or have used, taking a minimum of 5 pictures of the built environment at each of those locations. And then we asked them to develop a 1 to 2 sentence caption per photo and share those photos with our researchers. Next, we took all of this together and started small group discussions with 2 to 3 participants each. And these users shared photographs and past experience with TNCs. They reacted to one another's photos and discussions. So the photographs really served as a jumping off point and were very helpful in terms of helping people visualize what individuals were speaking about. And we had them answer focus group type questions about incentives and linkages to public transit. And then finally, as I mentioned, we moved into a workshop. This was all online as well with our TNC users, and they shared their photographs again and their perspectives, but now in a workshop setting with key stakeholders. And that was really interesting because we walked them through a guided protocol, and stakeholders were also able to share their reactions to policy strategies and suggestions to help improve pooling, and for both groups to learn from one another. So the small group discussions included 15 ride-hail users. So we're talking about a very small subset because this work was very intensive. And that work occurred in 2021. There were 7 frequent ride-hailing users and 8 periodic TNC users. So we tried to have, a pretty even distribution between the two. There were 8 male ride-hailing users and 7 female. And we also had 5 1.5-hour small group discussions in which we brought 2 to 3 of those participants together. And those also occurred in 2021. And as I noticed, we went through a lot of the photographs, experiences with pooling, experiences at the curb, feelings of safety, and a discussion around incentives and how we could encourage people to link to public transit, but also to pool. With the stakeholder workshop, we had 12 of the 15 Photovoice participants join us, and 5 transportation stakeholders from the public and private sector, as well as a non-governmental organization. And that was a 2-hour workshop, and we conducted that later in that year of 2021 in July. And as I noted, the Photovoice findings were presented by the participants themselves, along with some of their recommendations. And everybody was there to exchange ideas and to talk about ways that we could work together to improve walking to and from pickup and drop off locations, how to take pool trips, how to connect those trips, and how to incentivize the pooling and the public transit linkages, that first mile, last mile connection. And then to garner any final feedback on potential policy strategies. So now we get to dig in and look at some of these photographs. So I'm going to present 3 of the composites that compile a lot of different images taken from that group of 15. So here what you can see is users prefer to wait in areas with wide sidewalks and open visibility of the road where it is easy to connect with the drivers. So when the driver's coming to pick them up, they can easily spot them, and that they're in an environment where there's enough space on the sidewalk where they feel safer. Second, users prefer pickup spots located near retail opportunities in safe neighborhoods that are away from homeless encampments. And so at the time of this study, we heard a great deal about not just concerns about COVID transmission, but that there was, it seemed a great deal more homeless encampments appearing in the areas that we studied. And what you can see here is photographs of the fact that a lot of people like to wait for their TNC driver to pick them up, maybe in front of a retail opportunity, and they could be in front of it, or they could even wait inside. And third, users like waiting at pickup locations that are well lit, have shelter or coverings, and have benches or seating availability. And so they actually really even like seating that allows them to face the street versus to have their backs at the street. And you can see that here. So very interesting in terms of built environment design. And then another opportunity that arose to us for future research, but to also improve the state of experiences, came from something we weren't necessarily probing for, but we saw very distinct differences between male and female TNC user preferences. So what we found in terms of the waiting location, male users are interested in a safe area where they can look at their phone. For some females, they are even reticent to look at their phone because that may be something that allows them to be targeted because they don't look like they're paying attention as much. Female users had a much stronger preference for waiting in or near a retail location, as I noted in the prior images. In terms of the waiting environment, male users tended to provide low foot traffic areas, where female users tended to prefer much more well-traveled areas, and suggested open or transparent shelter areas, even ones that might be locked in some cases, where you might access that through an app. Additional safety precautions taken by female users is to have a male order the ride for them, so it looks like it's a male passenger, not a female passenger, and walk or wait with them at the curb. Waiting near a security guard or a police officer, and changing their drop-off location so drivers and passengers don't know exactly where they live, and sharing their location and trip information with an outside party. And this was something that was starting to become more common in the ride-hailing apps around this time. In terms of other key findings, frequent and periodic TNC user differences. So what we saw here, so they're not gender-related differences, but frequency of use. In terms of travel preferences, more frequent users tend to connect to public transit more, and we've seen this in a number of studies. and they're more inclined to take an indirect pool T&C trip, so walk a little bit. Periodic users take direct T&C trips, pooled or private, but they don't have a tendency to desire or want to participate in walking to an indirect site. In terms of infrastructure preferences, locations with easy driver access and less concerned about the built environment features or amenities. We have some thoughts on that too. And then in terms of periodic users, they really prefer the wider sidewalk, the lighting, and that low foot traffic as opposed to a higher foot traffic. Incentive preferences. The frequent users really preferred rewards programs and bundled trip discounts, and the periodic users naturally were more interested in individual trip discounts because they're not taking it so frequently. So let's move onward. In terms of overall recommendations coming out of the study, built environment changes, employing curb markings, signage, strong lighting to create designated pickup and drop-off areas on busy streets and near popular destinations. We also learned about the importance of partnership. So supporting partnerships between those local retailers and the TNCs to designate stores as waiting locations that support both pooling and safety alongside the existing infrastructure. In-app locations, so in assisting the ride-hailing companies and offering designated pickup areas and safe waiting locations. So this is coming more from the city side. How can the city help to facilitate more of a safe experience and help with the TNCs in that regard with respect to the built environment? And in-app safety features. Now, these are much more popular, as many of you may use them now. I do. They were suggested at a time when they were, I think, less popularized, but encouraging TNCs to incorporate these in-app safety features to provide riders with more upfront trip information, options to share their trip information with emergency contacts, and the location of nearby security personnel. Now, some of these things are not currently part of the in-app features, but they could be built upon. Pricing and policy strategies. So incentives, developing packages to encourage pooling might include regular and consistent trips, for example, to employers or schools, non-urgent trips, for example, to recreational activities, and trips to and from popular destinations like airports and events. Next, integrated fare payment. There's a lot of discussion about facilitating partnerships that integrate fare payment systems to provide discounts for modal transfers and to ensure that we're making more multimodal trips, so first mile, last mile connectivity. New technology has been suggested in terms of enabling that integrated fare payment using near-field communication systems to allow users with smartphones to make one payment for their whole trip. So that first mile, last mile component and that transit trip. And then in terms of public transit connections, really facilitating them by incorporating trip schedules, stop and station locations, and directions in ride-hailing apps themselves. So making some more improvements there. In terms of next steps and future research, it's been suggested that we look at service equity, understanding how to address service inequities that arise due to user-selected safety preferences and geofencing. For example, reducing service in areas that are perceived as less desirable. So addressing that so that we don't see inequities in, for example, low-income communities. Goal alignment. So identifying how incentives can be used to align the goals of the drivers themselves and the users. So encouraging drivers to focus on customer trip satisfaction overall, as opposed to total number of trips through new policies that could be implemented at the company level. Public transit, exploring policy options for improving transit operations and safety to encourage travelers to shift to transit. During this time, we heard a lot of concerns about public transit safety due to homelessness and other issues that were occurring. In many cases, those types of considerations are continuing to appear in research associated with transit really needing to focus on improving overall safety. So that's going to be the same when you start thinking about creating a link between first mile, last mile, TNC trips, and public transit. If there's a concern about safety in public transit, it's less likely you're going to see that multimodal connection. And same with TNCs themselves. And then finally, gender equity. Coming out of this study, we were really intrigued to see more research that looks at the root causes of gender differences in safety perceptions and how that might be addressed. So some of our key takeaways. The Photovoice method really allowed us to engage with TNC users in performing the data collection itself. It helped us to understand better the role of the built environment. And we were able to also talk to people about incentives and shifting behavior alongside pooling and TNC connectivity. Network development. So we really think that developing a network of partnerships between the public and private sector and even retailers, for example, could really help to improve the TNC experience, and incentives might help to create more multimodal pooling behavior and even those indirect pooled trips. But we really need to think about creating a safe waiting location environment for that. And so making sure that we think about that when we're trying to encourage pooling, not just focusing on the incentives themselves, but what's the user experience at that curb. And finally, future research could focus on pooled mobility services and their social equity considerations by looking at gender-related perceptions. And that could go well beyond gender and look at other communities like people with disabilities or other areas of social inequities like low-income neighborhoods. So with that, I'd like to take an opportunity to thank all of the TNC users and the TNC ride-hail stakeholders that participated. You can see the long list of individuals, everyone from AC Transit to the California Public Utilities Commission that regulate TNCs in our state, City of Oakland, Kent State University. You see a number of the companies, Lyft and Via and Uber. The Photovoice World helped us with this, University of Buffalo, BART, Transform, and of course the UC campus itself. So really delighted to share this research with you. And I just want to conclude with the reference, if you're curious, to that larger study that I had mentioned, in which we really started to look at differences between frequency of use, but also indirect and direct pooled services. So that's the reference to that. So with that, I will stop my share and be happy to entertain questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Shaheen, for your very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. We appreciate you, taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us. Okay, so I got a few questions listed here. The first one is, so subways, buses, etc., are indirect pooling, or was public transportation not part of this?
So when we talk about indirect pooling, we're talking about the TNCs themselves. But a lot of times, right, what we're looking at is, could we set up indirect pooling at a transit station itself? So essentially people would have to walk to that area to get a pooled ride. And we're hoping that what they're doing is actually using transit to create a multimodal trip, not just using it as a pooled indirect site.
Yeah, thank you. So the second question I have here is, was there time of day differences in gender preference?
Yes, we did see some time of day differences, but we wouldn't say that they stood out significantly. So, nighttime, what we found was people were more inclined to want to wait inside a building or really closer to that retail operation because they just felt safer in that environment. So definitely nighttime is a factor when you think about pickup and drop off for a TNC.
Okay, thank you. So the third question here is, will there be any autonomous shared mobility operators be included in the future study? If yes, yeah, how will they affect the study?
Yeah, I've actually had a question on this, and here's the scoop. I actually have proposed to do Photovoice with a shared automated vehicle company, and was funded by the Department of Energy with another campus. And unfortunately, that company went out of business. And so we are looking to see if we could apply Photovoice in a shared automated vehicle setting. It makes a lot of sense. And in the one other presentation that I made of this research, I got the exact same question. So I think we're thinking along the same lines.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Really
very interesting. Yeah, to see. Yeah. Okay. So the next question I have is, how about the COVID impact on pooling?
Yeah, so COVID definitely took an impact on pooling. And in fact, only until more recently, say around the spring of this year, did we start to see both Uber and Lyft bringing it back. Uber was the first to bring it back, and then Lyft came in subsequently. And it's not universal across all cities, as many of you might know. So pooling rates and ride sharing, the carpooling, as I call it, and van pooling, everything is down. In fact, what we saw was a lot of people going and buying cars. So the impacts on several shared mobility modes have been quite notable in terms of who lost in terms of the overall ridership or use of a service. And car sharing was one of the winners. So services like Zipcar, or what we have here is a one-way service called Gig Car. A lot of people liked it because they could clean their car, be in a car alone, take those windows down, and being in more shared vehicles tended to be something that people steered away from. Although we did see a lot of people taking the single-use TNC vehicles, but there were declines. And I don't have a graphic to show you, but one of the interesting slides I show when talking about this is in the TNC market, we saw this decline of single TNC trips because pool trips were stopped, and this big increase in services like Uber Eats. So those courier services. So COVID has definitely impacted the marketplace. You might also note that the cost of TNC rides have gone up quite notably. And so the taxi industry has been a beneficiary of some of that playing field. And the other thing that we saw was a loss of the driver market. And we're seeing that in transit, we're seeing that in trucking. So lots of impacts of COVID that are still playing out.
Yeah, thank you. So any more questions from the audience? You might not get a chance to type it, but it's time now for you to bring that question up. Yeah.
I was curious, has anybody heard about Photovoice being used in research?
No, massive. I never heard of it yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
interesting
it's a
to know.
method that's often used in public health. And so I think it really does need to be applied to like a physical experience or environment, right? So the built environment itself, or I could imagine it in an SAV study being used to take photos inside the vehicle itself as well. But I was really excited to use it. And despite the fact that we weren't able to implement it the way it typically is used, where the researchers would go out with the participants and they're taking the photos and chatting with you. You're not prompting them too much. They're talking about why they took the photo. But I think all in all, we were able to get through those 1 to 2 sentence descriptions a pretty good understanding of why they took the photo. And that was one of the things that concerned me, right? It was like, oh, well, we get the photograph, but why did they take that photograph? What did that photograph mean?
It's great to know one more terminology. No, yeah, that'd be interesting. So I got one more question pop up here. So do you think location preferences for scooters or other non-ride-hailing multimodal transportation would be similar? Yeah.
I think the built environment for shared micromobility is a really interesting question. We do hear a lot about concerns about the infrastructure for safe riding. No, in many cases, no protected bike lanes or people feeling like they have to ride on a sidewalk. So I think this method could be very interesting at applying it to. And I have investigated whether or not we could do that. I think the findings might be different because active transportation as a mode is different from having somebody pick you up in a vehicle. But concerns about, I think, lighting could be quite similar. But I would suspect we'd hear more about parking for those devices and the physical infrastructure for facilitating those rides or keeping the rider safe. That might come up quite a bit in a way that you wouldn't see with indirect or direct pooled rides, or even a pickup location at a transit station. That's a great question.
Yeah, I think that's all I have here. So, Dr. Shaheen, I know your schedule is very packed, so please feel free to leave anytime as needed, or you are certainly more than welcome to stay a bit longer if your schedule allows.
Oh,
yeah,
well,
thank you very much for being here, and appreciate your time and the support of CAMMSE. Yeah.
Oh, well, go CAMMSE, and wishing you guys all the best with the next UTC competition. And I hope to see many of you at TRB. Okay, yeah. Thank you very much again. Yeah, thank you. So at this point, we're going to move on directly to the third technical session on public transit and emerging mobility services. So the moderator will be Dr. Yi Qi from Texas Southern University. So Dr. Qi, please take it away.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yi Qi from Texas Southern University. It's my pleasure to be here to moderate the afternoon section. So I think we have a very exciting section. Our topic will be public transit and emerging mobility service. Okay, so our first speaker will be Dr. Mehdi Azimi from Texas Southern University. He will talk about COVID-19 effects on bike share usage and ridership in Houston. Dr. Azimi, are you there, Dr. Azimi? Okay, if you are ready, you can share your screen, then we can start rolling. I saw him before. Okay, he's here. Hey, Dr. Azimi. He may have some technical problem because I saw he already unclicked his microphone. Okay, let's give him a few minutes. Okay, I saw his screen is sharing. Okay, Dr. Azimi, are you able to use your speaker? Because we cannot hear you yet. Okay, your screen is on. Okay. Okay, by the way, the picture Dr. Azimi shared is the picture I think he took in our campus, this TSU campus. We have a bike share station right on our campus.
Yeah, it looks very nice. Yeah.
Yes. For TSU, we don't have bus route go through TSU, so bike sharing is one of the options for our students to use the public transit and use the bike sharing as a last mile and the first mile solution.
Hello.
Hey, Dr. Azimi, how are you?
Hi, how are you? So
Okay.
I don't know why I have problem with it. Sorry. So thank you, Dr. Key, Dr. Fan. Let me start the presentation. Can you see the presentation, the slide view?
Yes, we can see the the two screen. So maybe you should use, yeah, that's better. Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
yes, sure. Okay, let's let me. How about now?
Yes, yes, very good. That's good.
Okay, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk about our research. It's looking at the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak on the bike share usage and ridership in Houston. So this work has been done, majority of the work, data collection and data processing by my research assistants, Mr. Mustafa Muhammad Wali. So, looking at the contents of this presentation, we'll start with the background on the bike share. And we talk about the goal and objectives of the research. We will talk a little bit about the literature review. We will see the data that we are using in this research, different types of the data. We look at the analysis and also the future work and ongoing work. So starting with the background, bike share system these days are growing fast in basically in major cities, metropolitan areas in the United States and other part of the world. Basically, it is a system that provides a bicycle for shared use for individuals. Usually it is used for the short-term period. In some places there is no cost, some places there is a cost involved. And it is affordable for the users in terms of the health and also for the environment. It's a very environmentally friendly mode of transportation. It makes the encourage the people to users not to the people not to use more vehicles and limit the increase of the private car usage. And in addition, encourage the transit by using the bicycle as a first and last mile solution. When we studied the literature, we found that the bike share, it had an COVID-19 pandemic had impacts on some major metropolitan in terms of the usage of a bike share. So we wanted to look at Houston to see that what has the impacts of the bike share COVID pandemic on the bike share usage. So if we summarized our goal and objective of our research, we are looking to see the impacts of the pandemic on the bike share system. And to achieve this goal, we had several objectives, collected the relative data, required data related to the bike share, and also the COVID-19 data cases in Houston. And we are looking for the analysis of the data for descriptive analysis and ultimately the modeling. So this is the map that you are seeing on the slide. It shows the bicycle station, bike share station in Houston. It's mostly it is in distributed around downtown area, around the major universities, and around the inner loop of inside the inner loop of 16 in Houston. So we look at the literature review, we search for the COVID-19 impacts on the bike share system. Totally 33 paper we find. There are so many papers talking about the COVID-19 impacts, but we found 33 published paper that was related to the bike share mode. Bicycle, mainly bike share. Different methods were used to consider to investigate the impacts of the COVID-19, and it depending on the availability of the data and the type of data. No study has been done for Houston bike share system, so that is the reason that we wanted to have a study on the bike share system in Houston. So we collected the data from different sources. We look at the data for COVID-19 cases from the city of Houston, from Harris County, both Harris County and city of Houston data portal hub. We look at the data, we collected the data from Bike Share Houston, B-Cycle, and that was for 2019 and 2020. We collected the data for 2019 because we wanted to compare the 2020, the pandemic, with the year before 2019. So the data that we collected, it had different, it included different attributes: membership type, checkout station name, return station name, trip duration, checkout date, return date, the time of checkout, and the time of return, and other information that we didn't need those information. So the first step after the data collection was to look at the data for the COVID cases. The first COVID cases reported in Houston in April 2020. The COVID cases data, we arrange it on daily as well as weekly basis, from Monday to Saturday for the week. So we plotted the data to have a better sense of the data. How was the COVID cases, daily cases. So this graph shows the daily cases that started from the April 2nd until the end of the year in 2020. So you see that we have a smaller cases in terms of the number for the cases of COVID until June, and at the end of the June, almost the end of the June, the cases we had increased. And also we look at the weekly cases for the COVID-19. For the weekly cases, if you look at the data, the graph shows the weekly cases, and as we also observed in the daily cases here, the graph shows the end of July, end of June, from the end of the June, the COVID-19 cases increased. It starts from the middle of the June with a slight increase, and then we had increase, sharp increase. So look at the around August, we had a reduction in the beginning of the August, and again, in October, we had a peak from the beginning of October. If we had an increase, and also we had another increase in mid-November 2020. So look at other types of another major type of data. It was a big bike share data that we collected. We removed we look at the data. We removed the zero duration trips. We have so many trips that the duration were zero. We find those trips and remove from our data. We had many records that it had service trips. It means that those trips, they were the bike were taken to the warehouse for the repair. So it was included in the data. So we eliminate those type of data as well. And then the remaining data was processed for each day and each week, Monday to Sunday. And at the end, we arranged the data based on the checkout date, the date that the bicycles were picked up. This graph shows the bike share trips per week in 2019, 1 year before COVID. And if we compare it with the 2020 data with the same scale, we see that we had increase in the bike share trips in 2020. And in this graph, we also included the COVID-19 cases that started in April. So from the graphs, we had some observation. We had overall increase. We observed overall increase in ridership during the COVID-19 period in 2020. During the mid-June, where COVID-19 cases increased, the ridership decreased. But most of the time, with an increase in COVID-19 cases, we had decreasing in the ridership. So except the October, if I go back to the graph, you see that in October we had increase in the cases. We have increase in the ridership. That was the observation that we had. We wanted to have more analysis for the trip and compare it in the pandemic and before pandemic. We look at the duration of the trips. We separate the trips with the different duration. We look at different trip duration, short trips, middle duration, and longer duration for the trips. For the short trips, we look at the trips that had the duration of 15 minutes and shorter. We had trips for 15 minutes to 30 minutes. We separate them. And then the longer than 30 minutes trips, we name them longer trips. So if look at this graph, this is the trip duration, the bike share activity that separated in the 3 different types of duration. So this is for 2019. That was 1 year before pandemic. Compared to the 2020, as you notice, we also plotted the COVID-19 cases in this graph. The orange graph and the orange data and the blue data shows the short duration and average duration, but the gray one is the longer duration. As you see, the longer duration and the number of longer duration increased during the pandemic. So what we observed from the graph, we had the observation shows that COVID-19 had impacts on the bike share trip duration, specifically for the longer trips. For longer trips, we have more trips that were 30 minutes or longer during the pandemic. So we were thinking to have to make it shorter duration. Look at the trips with shorter duration. So this time we had another grouping. Instead of having 3 groups, we grouped the trip to 7 groups: 0 to 5 minutes, 5 to 15 minutes, 15 to 30 minutes, 30 to half an hour, half an hour to 1 hour, or 1 hour to 2 hours, and longer than 2 hour, half an hour to 1 hour, 1 hour to 2 hours, and more than 2 hours, 2 hours to 4 hours, more than 240 minutes. So we look at those trips in different groups, and we plot for 2019. So the bar chart shows each group of the trips, and also we concentrate in the 6 months, the first 6 months during the pandemic. So we look at the March to August 19, because the pandemic started in March. So we look at March, April, May, June, July, and August, and look at March, April, May, June, July, August of 2020 for during the pandemic. The reason that we look at the only 6 months this time, we wanted to have, because we looking at the data, the previous plots, after a while, so we observed that the impacts of the COVID-19 on the trips were decreased. So we look at the 6 months that are close to the pandemic, the first 6 months of the pandemic, to have a better relationship between the pandemic and the bike share activity. So during different months, as you see, comparing 2019 and 2020, we can see that the trips that had 30 to 60 minutes, we have the number of trips were increased in 2020, and the rest of the trips, if we look at the other types of trips, the trips that had less than 15 minutes duration, they decreased during the pandemic, and as I mentioned in the graph, when I'm showing the graph, more trips with duration 30 to 60 minutes happened in 2020 compared to 2019, and there were no difference in the significant difference in the number of trips with the trip duration of 120 minutes and longer in 2019 and 2020. So also, we look at the different time of the day. We look at the different peak hours, morning peak hours, 6:30 to 9:30 a.m. We look at the evening peak hour, 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. and off-peak period, off-peak hour in the day. We observed that majority of the trips for the Houston bike share happened during the off-peak period, off-peak traffic, I mean. And then we had more trips in the evening and then in the morning peak, during peak hour. In 2020, overall increase in other times of trips we had compared to the morning and evening peak hour period. So look at here, the graph that we had, the observation, we had less number of morning peak time trip, and then we have evening and the off peak. That it was for 1 year before pandemic, and we had a similar trend for the year that we had pandemic, 2020, and we had the COVID-19 cases in the graph. Based on the observation, the most of the ridership trip, bicycle trip, happened during the off-peak hour in Houston. So we look at different months in 2019 and different time of the day, basically for every half an hour, to see that in which specific, that was another analysis that we did, to see that which hour, during which period of the time we had more trips. During 2019, in the first 6 months compared to the pandemic, starting from March to August, because we look at the same month that we had pandemic, we wanted to compare apple with apple. So we started looking at March, because pandemic started in March 2020. So the first 6 months, March 19, April, May, June, July, and August, the graph shows for all the months, it's somehow have the same trend for the number of the trips in different hours. Every half an hour, we look at 24 hours every half an hour. Most of the trips happens during after in the evening, the peak. And here what we have, it is 2020. So we have the trips that it was different in different months, and after pandemic. During the pandemic, it was more close to each other, the numbers, but after pandemic, it was different. As you see here, the first 2 months, March and April, we have less trips during the hour in the evening time, but you see that it was increased in the following month. Results that I share with you is a part of our project that it is ongoing. We are going to model the data to see that what is the impacts of the bike COVID-19 on the bike share activity, but what we concluded from the descriptive analysis is we had an overall increase in bike share ridership during the COVID-19. We had a longer trip duration, 30 minutes or longer, in 2020 compared to 2020, basically the longer trips were increased. Number of trips with duration less than 15 minutes decreased in 2020 compared to 2019, non-pandemic year. And looking at different duration, more trips with the duration of 30 seconds or to 60 minutes we had in 2020 compared to 2019. And there was not much difference in the number of trips that had duration of 120 minutes to and longer in 2020 and 2019. That ends my presentation. If you have a question, I would be glad to answer.
Any question from the audience? So, sorry, okay. I have no question. We should move on to next speaker. I think it's a very interesting presentation, Dr. Azimi. I know it's an ongoing efforts. I just have a general question of when you analyze the bike data, did you consider the weather or seasonal impacts? Because we're in the Houston area. Sometimes summer is too hot for people ride the bike.
Yes, that is, yes, you are very right. That is those parameters we have it to consider in the model. Definitely the rain and the temperature have impacts on the ridership. One thing that I wanted to add is some of the literature that we reviewed, they look at the impacts of the cases, daily cases on the daily ridership. One thing that we were thinking that they look at the number of the cases for the daily is not very correct, because the number of the cases each day has no impact on the cannot have impacts on the ridership in the same day. So it is not like a temperature and rain. So rain and temperature is more important parameters than COVID-19 for the daily analysis. So that is, those are those two parameters, yes, we are considering for our modeling.
Good. Thank you, Dr. Azimi. Okay, thank you for the presentation. And let's move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker will be Dr. Carol and Atkinson-Palombo from University of Connecticut. And Dr. Palombo will talk about the characteristics of pooled trips offered by ride sourcing service in Chicago. Dr. Palombo, are you ready? Take off.
Yes, thanks. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes,
okay, and then you can hear me, right? So that's great. Thank you very much, everyone. So I'm happy to be sharing some research today that was conducted by Lauren Romeo, who was a master's student at the University of Connecticut in civil and environmental engineering. And the other people who were on this project is Davis Chacon-Hurtado, who is a research professor in civil and environmental engineering, Dr. Norman Garrick, who is now a professor emeritus of that department, and myself, and I'm from the Department of Geography. So the focus, excuse me, the focus of our study was ride sourcing trips that took place in Chicago, a Midwestern city that lies on Lake Michigan. And it's a city that encompasses a wide array of neighborhood types, from a bustling downtown to wealthy residential areas with perfectly manicured lawns, to communities that have been left behind. Such a diverse setting provided rich information for us to assess our research question, which is what factors contribute to the desire to pool a ride-sourcing ride, and what factors impact whether or not this desire to pool is met. So I'll just explain some terminology that I'll be using in this presentation. So when requesting a ride, a user is given the option to share their ride with another person who has a similar journey to theirs. If they do so, the trip is shared trip authorized. From there, a trip may be either successfully matched with another trip, in which case the trip becomes pooled, or it's not successfully matched. And we use these data to sort of distinguish between whether or not a trip met these criteria in order to sort our data into different trip types. So we examined data such as trip miles, trip seconds, time of trip, and pickup and drop off coordinates, and also the fare, to understand how these variables influence authorization and pooling rates. And after filtering, we were left with 75 million trips that were taken in 2019. So at this point, I do want to sort of point out that all of this analysis was done using data that is pre-COVID. So of these 75 million trips, about 16% was shared trip authorized. And of those, the majority were successfully matched to another trip. As mentioned, Chicago is an extremely diverse city, but it also experiences noticeable segregation. This map shown here depicts the concentration of different racial groups throughout the city, the green being Black. So we can see here that the majority of Chicago, the majority of downtown Chicago is largely white, and the western side has a large Hispanic population that's depicted here in orange. So these patterns were really important to keep in mind throughout our study. Because the city has such a high degree of diversity, we wanted to understand the role of different types of environments in pooling trips. Through clustering similar tracts, we could get a sense of what general characteristics have the most influence on various attributes of pooling we investigated. So in order to cluster the census tracts, we used 17 variables. Many of the demographic variables that we used were obtained from the 2017 American Community Survey 5-year estimates. Information about jobs, and that was as of 2017, was obtained through the LEHD origin destination employment statistics data provided by the census. And we obtained a shapefile of the city from the Chicago data portal to determine population, job densities, and transit availability. And we classified all of these data into a hierarchical cluster analysis using Ward's method. The process resulted in 8 different groups being selected. And we've just sort of, for simplicity's sake, just called out 3 of the clusters here. So cluster A has got medium levels of transit, low activity, and that's sort of determined in terms of jobs and population, low income, and majority Black. Cluster C has low transit, medium activity and income, and majority Latino, and cluster G is comprised mostly of transit-rich, high activity and income, majority white tracts. So we used these tracts to partition our data and found that the cluster groups had very different rates of pooling authorization. With cluster A, again, that's the low income Black neighborhoods, having the highest level of pooling at 42%. So this chart shows the percentage of pooled rides authorized versus median income. And we can see that there's a negative correlation between income and the percentage of trips authorized to be pooled within a tract. And other factors that contribute to willingness to pool include the time of day, and peak commuting hours see the highest authorization rates. Trip miles, which have a positive correlation, and the cost of the trip. And the relationship here is that there's reduced willingness to pool as the price increases. So when looking at our data, we noticed a downward trend in shared trips starting in March, as seen in this graph. Shared trip authorized rides declined by 55% from the period between January through March and October through December. And the effects were most pronounced in the downtown tracts. So we had to look further into this because it was quite a significant change in the trend. And we found out that a change in pricing from the Uber and Lyft companies took place at this sort of transition point. And so we dug into that a little bit more in detail and found that the fare per second individual rides remained relatively constant, and but the fare and number of seconds of pooled rides rose by about 30% from January to December. And so this price increase may have actually been a deterrent to pooling. So one of the things that we decided to examine was to look at whether assess whether the impact of this fare increase on the willingness to pool. We looked at it for different cluster groups, and the metric that we used was the price elasticity of demand. So if the absolute value of the elasticity is greater than 1, the demand is considered to be elastic, meaning that it's susceptible to demand changes once price changes. And in our study, we measured price elasticity as the percentage change in the demand for pooled rides divided by the percentage change of the price of pooled rides. So higher price elasticities are associated with cluster groups that have higher incomes, which may be reflective of areas that have high disposable incomes. I will just sort of mention that we do not have any data in the publicly available sort of ride sourcing data that has any attributes of the actual riders. And so we are inferring a lot from the sort of origin and destination of the neighborhood. So we can say it's not necessarily people who live in low-income neighborhoods, but it will be people that are picking up or dropping off in a low-income neighborhood. So in contrast, low-income areas have relatively inelastic demand. And what that suggests to us is that the people have become dependent on these ride sourcing services, and maybe it's because there's not much transit in those areas. It could be that the shared rides are still offering a more affordable service than individual rides, but it could also hint at transportation equity issues. So pooling success refers to how many shared trip authorized trips are successfully matched to another. Most clusters see similar levels of pooling success, but values largely fell in the range of between 70 and 74%. Success declined with the fare increase from 77% between January and March to 67% between October and December. So we found that pooling success is also affected by rail stops, since there was a higher success in drop-off tracks with rail stops, trip miles with longer trips being more likely to get pooled, and the location of the person requesting the trip relative to the downtown area, with the optimal distance dependent on the time of day. So some of our findings of this research could be that researchers like ourselves could benefit greatly from more robust data from the companies themselves. Our findings are limited by the data set's lack of ride specifics. One of the things that we were disappointed in was that there are no occupancy numbers. So it's just sort of whether or not a ride is pooled, but we don't have any sense of how many passengers are in there. The exact fare and information was also not available, and the specific pickup and drop-off information were not made available either. They were all aggregated to the census tracts. It would also be really helpful to have some information about the demographics of riders and the trip purpose. So as Susan had presented in her keynote earlier, gathering data with that level of information is quite time intensive, and you have to do sort of qualitative methods to obtain that. And we were hoping to be able to do some follow-up research, but as I said, this sort of all got tangled up with the pandemic. But one finding from our research is that the number of trips available is likely an important contributor to pooling success, since this is related to many of the factors that influence success rates, and pooling would be enhanced by more users choosing that option. But we did have some concern about the ability of the TNC companies to alter pricing. So measures such as shared trip authorization rates and price elasticity indicate that lower income census tracts exhibit more reliance on shared rides. And from an equity standpoint, this signals that there are fewer mobility choices available to those populations, which is a gap that pooling may be used to fill. And that's just that's it from our group, and I would be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Dr. Palombo. It is an excellent presentation. Do we have any question from our audience? Let me see the question. Not yet. Okay. Very interesting research. One thing I wanted to ask is, did you consider the security impacts on the pooling successful rate? For example, the time of day in the later night, maybe not safe for people to do the pooling?
We didn't, it's a really great question. And one of the things that said that the data on the origin and destination are aggregated to the census tract. So we don't have point specific data, which is why if we wanted to examine security aspects or anything like that, we would probably want to have more fine-grained data. And I really appreciated Susan Shaheen's analysis on looking at those. So I think it will be a different method than using the big data that we had on the trips. But it's a great point. Yes.
Good. Thank you. Very interesting research.
Thank you.
Good. Okay, so if there's no question from audience, let's move to the next speaker. Oh, sorry, the next speaker is me. Okay, so, okay, now I will present my research on the impacts of COVID on public transit ridership. So let me share my screen and first, okay, so screen sharing, okay. Okay. Okay, can everyone see my screen now? I guess the answer is yes, right? Okay, good. Good afternoon, everyone, again. So this is my research on the impacts of COVID-19 on public transit ridership. We did it in the last year, actually. So there's some interesting research I would like to share with you today. Let me talk about the background of the research. Okay, so we know when the COVID hit us on the beginning of 2020, the public ridership was have a big drop. So this is a graph we draw for the top 20 metropolitan area across the country. See the New York, Chicago, Houston, they're all the different area we analyzed. So you can see from this graph, we compared the ridership reduction rate between the 2020 and the 2019. The 2019 is the year without COVID. So we can see at the beginning of 2020, at that time, COVID was not reported yet. The reduction rate is kind of low, around 0. Then the first case of COVID was reported in January 21. So you can see in the March, we have a big reduction in the transit ridership. So this percentage is a percentage of reduction. So then the reduction keep growing until to the April, we reach the highest points, the reduction. See, for example, in the New York, the reduction was up to like 85%, because New York hit by the COVID hardest. Okay, so we can see because of COVID, the public transit ridership have a huge reduction, and this thing was kept going on for this whole year, the 2020. So we draw the graph for the 12 months from the beginning of 2020 to the beginning of 2021. Okay, so this the background for this research. Because of this job, we wanted to analyze the impacts of COVID. And what we found that the impacts of COVID have different impacts on different socioeconomic groups. For example, the low-income group, they are more reliant on the public transit. So the impacts, the reduction rate will be smaller. And also some essential workers, for example, the people working in the supermarket, in the hospital, they still need to go to work, use transit. So therefore, the reduction rate also not so significant. Then for the people on the other side, for the people who work in the information management and the technology related field, they are able to work at home. So they're more likely for this kind of a neighborhood, they have bigger, reduction in the public transit ridership. Another thing will have impacts on the different group is the educated and the low income. Their home is not very good for the work at home, the environmental, because, for example, they don't have enough room to separate the kids and the adults, and they don't have the reliable internet service to allow the people work at home. So all these things affect the demand for the public transit during the COVID. Okay, so because of this thing, so our research was to the goal of this research is to conduct a nationwide study to investigate the impacts of COVID-19 on the public transit ridership. Specifically, we have 3 objectives. First, we want to investigate what is the cause for the reduction. We know some of them very obviously, but we want to, deeply take a look at to see what is the reason. Then the second thing, we wanted to develop some quantitative measure to measure the level of fear, the public fear towards the COVID in our area, because this will affect the people to choose to use the public transit. Another thing, finally, we want to develop a mathematical model to analyze the impacts of COVID along with other socioeconomic factors on the transit ridership reduction during the COVID. Okay, so this is what we are going to do for this research. Okay, so let's talk about the first objective, why the public transit have such a reduction. So there's different type of reasons that have both demand side reason and also have the supply side reasons. For the demand side, we all know when the COVID starts, we have the lockdown or the stay home orders. So this caused a dramatic reduction in the trip demand. Okay, so this is one obvious reason. The second is, as I mentioned before, the people started to work at home and the kids started to take a virtual class at home. So all these things will further reduce the demand for the trip. I think even right now we have some companies, some industries still allow people to work at home for certain days or certain time period. Okay, so then the third one is the public was worried about exposure to the COVID. So the public transit, we are collectively move the people in a confined space. So that's have more risk to get COVID. So that's why they intensively avoid to use the public transit. So this is the demand side reasons. Then we also have supply side reasons. So during the COVID, we need to keep social distance. So most of the public transit companies, they reduce their capacity. They not allow people to sit closely side by side. They have reduce the capacity to 50% or sometimes even to 25% in order to keep the safe social distance. So therefore the demand was also reduced. Another thing is because of COVID, they have enough insufficient workforce. The people was sick, the people was not able to go to work. And then they also have the reduction in the revenue and also because we have to clean the bus, we have more stringent cleaning process. That's all cause the operation cost increased for the transit agency. Then in order to keep their service, they reduce some service. They just keep the essential route, essential function during the COVID. Okay, so this is the supply side reasons. Because of both reasons, the transit ridership was have big reduction. Okay, so in order to do further analysis, we collect the data from different metropolitan areas in the United States, and we collect the top 20 biggest metropolitan area, including New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and also include. So this lists the area and their population. We select based on mainly based on the population and also the amount of annual ridership. Okay, then the time period we collected that, as I mentioned, because COVID started in the end of the January, so we collected the 1 year data from the February 1st to the January 31, 2021. So this is 12 months from the COVID start, and then we collect the 3 different types of data. First is the number for confirmed COVID case, the number of deaths during the study time period. We collect this data from the US Factors official website. And then we also collect the public transit ridership data, okay, from the same time period. And we collect from the both the set time period and the year before, because we want to compare the ridership, reduction things. So we collect this data from the National Transit Database and from the Federal Transit Administration. The next thing we collect data of select the metropolitan area. We collect this data from the American Community Survey and the United States Census Bureau. So these are 3 types of data and information we collected from different sources. Okay, so let's talk about the second objective. I mentioned that we are going to develop a quantitative index to measure the severity level of the COVID in a certain area, or measure the public level of public fear towards the COVID. Okay, so the reason we want to have this kind of index is we reviewed the current studies, and we found in most of the studies they used 2 types of COVID measurements. One is number of confirmed case and the number of deaths. Okay, but the limitation for directly use these 2 measures is these 2 measurements are highly correlated. If you have more confirmed case, you more likely have more deaths caused by COVID. So if you directly include in this in your modeling, it will create some problem. And the second is these 2 measurements also very related to the population size of area. If you have more population, you tend to have more confirmed case and deaths. So therefore, it's not good for we apply the model to other area with different populations. So that's why we'd better to have another index, okay, to better measure the impacts of COVID or the public fears towards the COVID. So in order to this, we do some literature search, and we found one thing called the composite index. This index was developed by some study for the stocks to forecast the stock market performance. So they use this composite index to measure the disturbance in the stock market caused by the COVID. So this is what they did. First, they developed an index called the reported case index, like confirmed COVID case during 14 days time period. So they compared the current case with the case 14 days before, and to see if the tendency is the increase or decrease, and what the level of increase. So they get this measured. And the same thing, they get this number of deaths also compared with the 14 days. The reason they choose 14 days is because the COVID symptom may appear up to 40, during the 40 days. Okay, so that's why they compared the increase or decrease rate during this 14 days to see if the situation of COVID in this location become worse or become better. Then the public will have different, fearness towards the COVID. So after they develop the individual index, they also combine them. They just use half and half, weighted half and half, then combine them together. So this is a composite index. And then after we develop the composite index, this is basically to measure the severity of COVID or the fear level towards COVID for that particular area. Then we start to develop a model. So we use a model to analyze our data. So in this model, the dependent variable is monthly, the year-to-year monthly reduction rate of an area, okay, during a particular month. And the independent variable includes this COVID index and also other social demographic variables such like household income, population, education level for a particular area. Okay, so we also did some correlation analysis in this study. So this is a statistical method we used. The reason we use panel data because in this study we collect data for 20 metropolitan area during the 12 months. So this is a panel data because this have the time dimension, also have the different individual. And as we know, because the different individual for the different months, they are very likely correlated because if the area have high rate of reduction rate, they are very likely during the whole 12 months are relatively high. So it's better for us to use the COVID, use the panel data model instead of the regular model. Okay, so this is the modeling thing. Then based on our analysis, this is our major findings. We find the following facts have positive will cause more reduction in the transit ridership during the COVID. First is the COVID the index, the composite index. If you have more severe COVID situation in a location, definitely you have more reduction in your ridership. So this is very reasonable results. And we also find if the location have more population with a bachelor's degree or higher, this area will experience more reduction in the public transit ridership. And then another thing, the median household income, the area with a high median household income will cause more reduction in the ridership. The last thing is the percentage of Asian population. So if you have the area have more Asian populations, the reduction rate all tend to be higher. We also find some factors will cause less reduction rate compared to other locations. First is the population in poverty. So if you have more low income population in this area, the reduction rate will be relatively low. And then another one is the percentage of Hispanic population. If this area have more Hispanic population, then the reduction rate also tended to be low. Okay, so this results, and also I think it's explainable. For example, if the location have more low-income people, the household in the poverty, so these households are more likely to depend on the public transit. So that's why even during the COVID, the reduction rate will still be low. Okay, so these are major findings. So what this study can do based on these findings, what people can do based on our findings. So there are some policy implications. So first, this according to the model we developed, we can predict which area have more reduction, which area with less reduction. So in this way, the transit agency can adjust their service during such pandemic situations. They can add more service in the area where more population depends on the public transit. And in the meantime, they can reduce their service in the area. There are a high proportion of the population that can choose to work at home or shift to other transportation mode like passenger car. So in this way, they can better, allocate their resource to make sure they will put more funding, more resource to the area that the population are highly dependent on the public transit. Okay, so this is the policy implications for this study, and we also identified some future study needs because right now we are already, almost past the COVID. So the public transit ridership was recovered a lot, not fully recovered, but almost recovered. So we have kind of crowded, bus, but meanwhile we are not require people, do the social distance. There's no social distance requirement, and people also now need to wear a mask. So how we can keep the public transit a safe and effective transportation mode. So this is something we needed to do some further research work. So specifically we want to impact the vaccination rate and other facts on the recovery of public transit ridership during the post-COVID era. Okay, so this is some future study needs we identified for this study. So with that, I'm ready to answer your questions. If you have any questions. Okay, since there's no more question, that's good. Okay, so let's move to next speaker. Next, we have Dr. Nicholas Lawrence from University of Connecticut, and he will present his research on a research perspective of integrating equity into public transportation planning. Let's welcome Dr. Lawrence.
Thank you, Dr. Chi. Here we go. I will share my screen. And hopefully everybody can see that. I'd like to thank Dr. Fan and the CAMMSE staff for putting on the symposium once again. Dr. Chi, thank you for hosting this session. And thank you to those of you who have stuck through the end of this day of the symposium. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the work our Public Transportation Systems group has done here at UConn on equity in public transportation. And this has been an ongoing theme. It's been research supported by CAMMSE, which we greatly appreciate. And I wanted to provide a little bit of context for the work that we've done in Connecticut. And the next slide will get into how we're at a bit of an inflection point in the types of equity analyses that are required by FTA and are being done across all sorts of research groups across the country and across the world. So our context here in Connecticut, when I started here at UConn, the Connecticut DOT identified a couple of trends that they wanted to try and get ahead of. This was a time when public transportation data sources were becoming increasingly available to the public, and the FTA was increasing their emphasis on Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and was focusing more on the Title VI programs that they are requiring every 3 years from large transit operators. And so this happened at a time when we were seeing transitions in the availability of data, in particular, the general transit feed specification, which I'll talk about here in just a few moments. In the state, we were at this time beginning to transition to real-time operations and performance data. Prior to about 2010 or 2012, there were manual data collection efforts by riders, employees of the DOT, going onto vehicles and counting boardings and alightings and tracking on time performance and that sort of thing. So the system was transitioning from older data sources to these newer, much more much larger data sets, and we were also seeing a transition from a cash-based system to off-board fare collection, which impacted operations and also impacted the way that patrons interacted with the system. In Connecticut, we have two large urbanized areas for FTA purposes defined as those with a population greater than 200,000. Title VI programs are required for systems operating more than 50 vehicles during the peak hour in those large urbanized areas. So Hartford and New Haven fit that description here in Connecticut. For comparison, the Charlotte metropolitan area has a little under 3 million people. The state of Connecticut has about 3.7 or 3.8 million people. Square mileage for the area is comparable. Connecticut's a little bit larger than the Charlotte metro area, but what we're talking about is a state that's the size of many large or smaller than large metropolitan areas in the country, but there's nearly 20 public transportation service providers. It's somewhat of a unique situation in that even though that there are a large variety of operators within the state, including rail service, bus rapid, and local bus, most of the FTA funding does flow through the DOT. So it's a different setup than what you find in many places, and it increases the complexity just a bit. And so we were working with the DOT to help them try to get ahead of the curve in terms of data availability and this increase in emphasis on Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. The reason I'm talking about this today is because I mentioned that we're at a bit of an inflection point. So last November, two primary guidance documents that are relevant for this type of analysis are basically announced to the world that they are looking to update these documents. The FTA Circular 47021B published an RFI on updating their guidance in implementing Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And these are the 5 areas, I won't read them to you, that they were focusing on. But in general, what they're requesting some information on and presumably looking to update is increasing the frequency of the analyses that are being conducted. Right now, Title VI programs are published every 3 years. And so any major service or fare changes or any performance issues that are experienced by a system over the course of those 3 years, after the fact, FTA is made aware of these and then responds to, or then reviews the response that the agency made to any of these issues. With the increase in data availability, they are considering a more frequent analyses associated with service and fare or facility changes along the way. They're also considering how they measure, access to public transportation, including looking at more specific access rather than just at the origin end, but examining how well the system provides service for households in providing access to food, to medical services, to jobs, or to government services. And all of this has significant data implications, analytical expertise impacts. And so they published this past November. We don't have a date when it's going to happen, but we can expect that they're going to be amplifying this circular in the not too distant future. Also last November, the Transit Capacity and Quality of Service Manual, the TCQSM, had an RFP to update the TCQSM for the same sort of reasons, with an increased focus on equity analysis. And I believe that the project kicked off last month and is a 24-month project. So within the next couple of years, we're going to be seeing an updated TCQSM, which has guided a lot of the ways that we analyze and measure access to public transportation across the country. And the third edition was building upon the second edition, which was published about a decade before, focused primarily on spatial availability of the systems, and had expanded on that significantly, getting into some of the weeds about how we measure these things. Now, for me personally, GTFS was a big deal. When I was in grad school, I finished in 2007, and the then Google Transit Feed specification was developed and implemented in Portland, Oregon, to provide kind of a standardized specification for transit systems, specifically in Google Maps. But what it did was provide a wealth of potential test beds for these different methodologies. It provided a lot of networks in a pretty easy to manipulate format. I guess just digressing a little bit, when I was working on my research as a graduate student, it was a real challenge to track down a network, to process it, to make it play nice with the analysis that you were trying to do. So this was a real game changer. And by 2009, it had gained momentum and was renamed the General Transit Feed Specification, which it is called today. And over the years, it started as 13 key field linked text files, or CSVs, has grown to 17. And depending on who you ask, 5 to 6 of them are required, 9 are optional, and 2 to 3 of them are conditionally required. And this has opened up a lot of opportunities for our research group and research groups across the globe to examine different means of not only looking at equity in service provision in transit systems, but also other modeling exploits. This is a quick summary of GTFS. It doesn't include all of the nuances of all of these different files, but this is roughly how they interact, with the ones highlighted in green being the conditionally required files, those in blue being the required, and the red being optional. In practice, we found that the shapes and calendar files are also required. So it kind of varies who you ask which ones are required, but this has provided a very rich data source for us in looking at ways in which we can examine transit accessibility, availability, and equity. So as we started this process, we were working to try and find a workable common definition of equity, and this has gained a lot of attention in recent years, and there is a lot of information out there about very precise definitions. I'm going to speak very broadly here about how we have viewed this and how we have approached it in our analyses. And this is a figure that you've probably seen before, comparing the ideas of horizontal versus vertical equity is one way to look at it. And another way of looking at it is the equality of inputs versus outputs. The idea being that there's the idea of horizontal equity, where everyone gets the same starting point, whereas in vertical equity, we're looking to boost those that might be disadvantaged so that we have more equality in the outputs. And I think the spirit of the FTA Title VI program, and I think the spirit that we've implemented it here in Connecticut, is focusing on the equality of outputs, trying to focus on areas that need more, in this case, transit service and more access to important destinations, to try and achieve that equality of outputs. Now, doing this in in a modeling context can be tricky. In looking in the literature from decades ago, there was some focus on looking at measures of equity that focus on the variance. So it's intuitive to say we want the in this case transit service provided across all regions, across all households. We want the variability, the variance between those households to be minimized. And when we looked at it from a modeling perspective, Steve Boyles at the University of Texas looked at this back in 2015 and found that we can wind up, when we look at variance as an equity measure, we can wind up with non-convex objective functions for those of you with an OR background. And in that case, we can wind up with getting stuck in a local optimum and missing the global optimum solution. And what he found and what he details mathematically is that an optimistic yet realistic target tends to be the best way to approach measuring equity or modeling equity, excuse me, because it maintains convexity and can then achieve a globally optimal equity-based solution. One of our former researchers here at UConn, Kelly Bertolacini, in the same year was looking at this problem from an application perspective and was examining a variety, in fact, 9 different objective functions, looking to optimally design bus routes for equity. And what she found was that those based solely on variance, and this table I don't expect you to read, it's there as just a kind of a visual, but those based on variance could lead to a race to the bottom scenario. That is where the solution, there's not much variability between households or between regions, but the solution was equally bad for everybody. And in a different context, Duthie and Waller also had identified this as a potential issue back in 2008, looking at it in a traffic assignment context. So as we were working with DOT, we were seeing this increase in data availability, particularly through GTFS and real-time data. We were starting to converge on ideas on how to measure equity in our system. And a popular means of doing this we looked at in 2013 was the Gini coefficient. And this is a popular means of measuring equity in the distribution of resources. You see it a lot in economics. And what we found was that you have to be careful, and we have to be careful in all of these analyses, but in particular, this one was sensitive to the way that we defined our system boundary, whether it was the metro area or the transit system service area, and also the aerial units that we chose to use, whether data was available, we chose to use data at the tract, block group, or in some cases, block level. These can have significant results or significant impacts on the results. And so this informed some of our work moving forward as we were looking at equity in transit service provision. I realize I'm running a little bit long here, so I will speed this up. Our early work focused mostly on spatial proximity to transit, and Shah Mamoon, who's now at the Ford Motor Company, sought to create a composite index using existing methods of measuring, and then developed his own, looking at various measures of access to transit systems based in part upon the guidance from the TCQSM and different methods of capturing the idea of transit availability. He further looked at how this relates to, there's a correlation analysis, not causation, but essentially looking at how well these areas in Connecticut, at least, were doing providing this accessibility to households that needed the service. So trying to identify perhaps gaps in the way that we're providing service here in Connecticut. So Kelly also looked to scale up her analyses, moving beyond the small system, the trial network, the Sioux Falls network, trial network, and the small system here locally to the transit system in Boston. And this gets to some of the issues that we've encountered with this idea of data availability, and then just the size of the data sets that we're dealing with in doing these equity analyses in large systems. And we started this, and it's a small university research group, and what we've seen is that as not surprisingly, as you scale this up, more and more very specific computational, algorithmic, and data engineering expertise is needed to be able to manage these large data sets that are updated pretty much continuously with the real-time data, and then process it at the frequencies that FTA is considering for their new circular and their new guidance. A CAMMSE project that we were working on for the past several years dug down even deeper into this, looking at some of those areas that FTA is interested in, looking at individual households, access to food, to medical services, government services, and jobs. And Rob Smith, conducted a point-to-point analysis looking at affordable housing units in particular, identifying this as a population that could use that boost so that we have perhaps a greater equality of outputs here in Connecticut. And this was a very data intensive process. So if FTA is looking to get this kind of analysis as part of their new circular, these data sets aren't readily available in a nice warehouse, at least that I'm aware of. We used business analysts to identify grocery facilities, but then had to clean that data up significantly. We didn't consider, a 7-Eleven or a CVS to be a source of good fresh food, for example. Finding, schools was part of our analysis as well. And the data is available, but it required significant effort to compile it all. And medical services, we have a licensed database here in Connecticut that's very useful, but again, there's a significant amount of data cleaning that needs to go into this to produce this type of analysis for a single metro area. So, as we look forward and as we, I guess, anticipate some amplifications from FTA and from the TCQSM, I guess is a bit self-indulgent as I'm looking forward as well. How do we address these issues? How do we work with our local governments and our local DOT to implement these in a sustainable fashion? And I think I've already mentioned a lot of this. These were kind of my takeaways. We're moving from a much more static type of analysis back in the 90s and early 2000s to a system in which routes and schedules change all the time. GTFS gets updated. We have real-time performance and ridership data coming in. And this is going to require a much more concerted effort in terms of data management and processing. There's been technology advancements that we're seeing here. They've been in place other places for a long time, but we're addressing this, and it's coming down the pipeline that we're going to have to leverage these new data sources, and we're trying to plan for that. One of our issues always is data reliability. Both if we're looking at high resolution census data, when you get down to the block level of a lot of this, of any available information, there's a lot of noise there. The real-time data, there's raw data sets that have their own issues, but also there's a process data set that includes certain, I guess, cleaning procedures that are implemented at the operators that we have to be aware of and that are going to impact our analyses moving forward. And then, as we've seen through a couple of presentations over the past hour, our demand isn't static. People move and people's behavior changes. Both, we're seeing fuel prices and potentially impacts from increasing fuel prices, and we've seen COVID have impacts. And these are examples of things we might want to try and anticipate moving forward and how we can be responsive. And, I also have a policy slide here. It's really trying to think about being responsive and anticipating some of these issues ahead of the amplified guidance, how we're going to marshal local resources to implement any new requirements. And especially from the last study, when we're talking about affordable housing decisions, that's not within the purview of the DOT. And though the Department of Housing here in Connecticut does consider access to transit in part of their funding criteria. And so it's one thing to be compliant with FTA guidance. And then I think moving forward, ideally, especially if we're getting to that idea of equality of outputs, it's working across these different agencies because they also have public transportation as part of their funding formulas. And I've already summarized this, so I will move to my last slide, and I welcome any questions or comments that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Lawrence. Very interesting topic.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see if we have any questions from the audience. Not yet. Okay.
Yeah, it's getting late in the day.
That's true. Yeah, but it's a very interesting topic, and we are here too. We're also doing some research related to equity and the public transportation. So we have some idea we need to can exchange it later.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a big topic for sure.
Good. I saw Dr. Randy McMell is here. So any questions from you, Dr. McMell?
Well, I have a student who's looking at public transportation and equity issues. Do you have any particular advice for her?
I would say, how's she approaching the problem so far?
Well, this all began with her efforts to document how the transit system had reacted to COVID. And basically, our transit system, like most others, reduced the frequency of some routes, canceled some routes, and left some routes as they were. And so she wondered if those changes equally affected all travelers. And she did a little bit of research into that and discovered that it really didn't seem to be very equitable at all. And so she's pursuing that a little bit more now to try to establish what would be a better scheme for analyzing, for the transit system to analyze before they make those kinds of changes. So.
Yeah. Well, and I'm wondering, because I would think that Cat Metro would be that would be part of their Title VI program. Yeah. Because those are pretty major service. Pretty major service changes. Although I'm sure that with the pandemic, there was a different level of scrutiny on those.
Yeah, and they point out that they were motivated to do these things for two reasons. One, they were having grand difficulty keeping enough drivers working to be able to put all the service out that they had planned to put out.
Yeah.
And secondly, they were running short on repair parts, so they couldn't always keep all the buses operating that they wanted. So they ran short of buses and drivers. And that's what motivated a lot of the cuts. And so anyway, they were responding to some external effects.
Yeah.
They didn't always stay within the equity guidelines.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess, as I'm thinking about, did she base it on the system? Like, is she looking at how close a bus line runs to a neighborhood, or
Yes.
did she have ridership data available?
She had ridership, but she took 3 routes and did a pretty detailed analysis of them.
Okay.
And she had information, socioeconomic data, demographic data, and ridership data.
Yeah. So I guess advice is, I think for one thing, it's going to be important moving forward. My personal opinion is I think FTA is going to start focusing on the destination end as well. So if she can look at, if she's able, I don't know how available it is in Austin, but to compile some of the information like Rob did on grocery stores, on medical facilities, on schools in particular, I think that's a big deal for vulnerable households.
Yep.
I think trans agencies are going to have to respond to that, and she'd be getting ahead of the curve there.
Okay. Good advice.
And Rob's working at our DOT now, and he's a great guy. And if she ever has any questions about compiling that, I'd be happy to put her in contact with him, because he's a really good resource. He worked his tail off putting all that together.
Okay, great. That's very helpful. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thank you, Dr. Lawrence and Dr. McMillan. Very good discussion. So I think this is the end of this session. I will turn the podium to Dr. Wei and let him to wrap up today's activities.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Chi. And nice to see you, Nick and Dr. McMillan again.
Yeah, Wei, and I apologize. I have to run. Jovi is getting off the bus here shortly, and I've got to go. I've got to go get my son from school and then run home real quick. So
I understand. Yeah, yeah.
thank you for putting this together, and I'll plan on tuning in tomorrow. So see you then.
Okay. Nice to see you. Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.
So thank you again. I think we had a lot of great presentation today. We have 2 wonderful keynotes. One from Dr. Harmer talking about the alternative designs, and then the second one coming from Dr. Susan Shaheen from UC Berkeley, talking about the shared mobility. Both are very well known, in their respective areas. And we also have 3 great technical sessions. One moderated by Dr. McMillan, and on advanced models for transportation planning and operations. And then the second one moderated by Dr. Chris Claudel on the transforming transportation with machine learning. And then the last one here moderated by Dr. Chi from Texas Southern University on public transit and emerging mobility solutions. And thank you all for the keynote speakers and session moderators and faculty presenters and also symposium participant, for your time and support of the CAMMSE. So looking ahead, tomorrow we're going to have 2 dedicated student presentation sessions. So in which we have a total of 11 students from all CAMMSE partner institutions who will make presentations. We have 2 judges who will evaluate and rate all presentations, and based on their scores, we're going to select and then make announcement of the top 6 student presentation awards. And then later on, we're going to send the gift cards to them as well, as we did in the past. So again, all sessions will offer PDHs. I think last but not least, we will start again at 8 o'clock Eastern time in the morning. I know it's too early for for the Western folks, and also probably for Dr. Mark Mill in Houston and Austin colleagues as well. Yeah.
It's okay.
It's all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just tell you a funny story about that. I was feeling sorry for myself having gotten up so early this morning. And I ran into my friend who was here when I got here. It was pretty early. And I asked him, well, what time do you get up? And he said, I get up at 4 a.m. every morning.
Oh.
Wow.
So that I don't feel so bad now.
Okay, so with that, I would like to conclude the first day of our fifth annual CAMMSE Virtual Research Symposium. So thank you again to all the speakers, presenters, and participants. We appreciate your time and support of CAMMSE. So, you know, have a great evening, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Okay, bye-bye. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Dr. Margaret. Dr. Shi. Yeah, thank you.
Tomorrow. Bye
Bye-bye.
now.
Bye-bye. Yeah.